Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Neo Insights series. Neo Insights series is a regular set of content that we both publish and typically published as a point of view, either through our website or published in a number of different magazines, like Outsourcing Magazine, Global Services, and others. One of the things we always try to do also is make sure that particularly areas that are of strong interest to companies, and I think many of you that may know Neo Group know that we focus on buy side primarily, actually focus only on the buy side. And so what's of interest to them, we want to make sure that we are constantly developing our thinking on it, our preparation on it, and then sharing content and knowledge and the experience that we're gaining to both our client base and to the larger community. I'm Atul Vashistha. I'm the CEO and founder of Neo Group, and I'm delighted to host today's webinar. And I'm also delighted that today's webinar, I am joined by one of our leading consultants who has deep experience, not just being a consultant at Neo Group, but also led significant initiatives around global sourcing, global services, both global in-house centers and partners at Electronic Arts. And in his number of years at Neo, he has led engagements for media companies, publishing houses, financial services, retail, consumer product goods, and others. So I'm delighted that we get to also hear from Pankaj and his experience. Pankaj, welcome to today's webinar.
Thank you, Atul, and good morning, everyone.
So before we begin, for those of you that may not know Neo, let me just take 2 minutes, and then we're going to jump into the content. As you think about this content, remember the content is all about what to source. How do you decide what to source? Please feel free to use the chat if you have questions or comments, both now and throughout. What I'll be doing is monitoring that, and we'll try to make sure we answer them as we go through the webinar today. So Neo is a company that was founded back in 1999, and the focus was to help companies manage the whole sourcing lifecycle. Recognition early on that most companies, as they looked at outsourcing or setting up their own centers around the world, that they would need help. They would need help with trying to understand what should they source, need help with understanding locations, suppliers, supplier capabilities, and really having the ability to make sure they were matching what they wanted to source, what needed to be done with the right partners, right locations, and then ensuring that transition and governance was done right. So we have deep expertise both from advisors who have prior experience doing this. We pair that with methodologies and approaches that have proven themselves, that have developed over a period of time, and pair that also on top of that with real-time research. So making sure that these advisors have not just methodologies, but also have access to the latest information on what's happening with location, suppliers, and the marketplace. And then a philosophy, a thinking, an approach, a culture that says we co-create this with our clients because our clients have deep domain expertise. Let's work with them. Let's integrate them into our process. And as you can see, a small sampling of some of our suppliers. We also have a service called Supply Wisdom, and Supply Wisdom is a supplier and location monitoring and guidance service. So let's jump onto the content for today. And Pankaj, I'm glad you've joined us today. So a question that we often hear from companies is, hey, what should I keep and what should I source, whether they're sourcing to a supplier or to their own global in-house captive? And how should I think about it? And many companies would call it retain versus source, core versus context. But irrespective of what that is, it's all about how do you make these decisions about what to keep and what to source beyond just seeing if somebody else is doing it, if a supplier is already doing it, because just because somebody else is doing it, how one looks at it in media entertainment might be very different than how they look at it in financial services. So what Pankaj and I are going to do is help walk you through our model, our approaches, our experience in how we think about it. And we've really broken this up into two sections. First, focused on technology, and then the second focused on business processes. So Pankaj, we know often when clients look at it, they look at it from let's think about technology first. They look at it both from first the technologies itself and then the role, which is the people working on it. And people have different definitions of what core is, right? Core can be some companies a very small part of their business, for others maybe a very large part. So Pankaj, from your experience, can you walk us through examples that illustrate this model and how companies, in your experience, how clients think about core versus context?
Sure. So let me start with an example from our recent magazine publishing client. And so one of the enterprise platform they use is PeopleSoft, their HR and finance modules. And we all know there are mature competencies and delivery models that exist globally for these modules. At the same time, these are very mature and mainstream support is available. And I think it's more about having an operational efficiencies in these, which makes these modules or these technologies more contextual. At the same time, if you have to look on the other side, they have an application which is OMS Print, and that supports print layout, inventory planning, subscription rules. And this has been developed and customized over a period of time and supports core processes across multiple functional groups, which impacts direct revenues. And this definitely provides a strategic advantage over competitors for them. So this kind of becomes core. And if I have to look at another example, again, one of the world's largest media conglomerate, the web designing using older and mature technologies such as HTML, Java, .NET, and they have a lot of that, again, is very contextual because very mature market in finding skills for that and also support and being supported from global locations. Whereas the evolving sector of the social, mobile, analytics, and cloud technologies, where solution design and rules are very core to the client acquisitions, data management, internal, external client communications, and there is a low availability of these skills in areas such as, I can give some examples like Hadoop or Scoop, which is a tool designed for transferring bulk data between Hadoop and structured data sources. That is what becomes very core for that client. Now, having said that, it's not that simple in the sense when you look at and say, okay, what application is core and what is contextual. At the same time, there may be certain elements within a core technology that could really be very contextual or could be globalized easily and vice versa. So I think as we progress and we overlay on this the assessment of roles or the analysis of the roles, it will become much more clearer in terms of how you have to look at it in a matrix way to come out with the final solutions of what could be globalized.
So I think, Pankaj, one of the key points you're making is, the way we look at it is the intersection, right? What is the intersection of a number of these things? Is it strategic advantage? Is it new? It's evolving. It's changing, and that intersection of all these different factors matter. And you just brought up a point, Pankaj, roles, and I have that slide right now on. Talk to us a little bit about, we may have an application that's core, but the roles necessarily may not be core on it. There's a big difference between an architect, a business analyst versus a tester. Can you talk a little bit about this model and how you see clients using it and how you advise on it?
Sure, and I'll take the same example from the same client, the media conglomerate, and we're talking about those applications or technology, and you bring up those roles like a tester, who is working from specifications to assist and develop and modifying the testing plans in both automated and manual test scripts, which ensures quality, reliability, and scalability of new and existing software applications. That's pretty contextual for some of the applications we talked about. Whereas from an architect, if the role is like of an architect who's establishing the basic structure of the system, which defines the core design features and elements that provides this entire framework of the software, and who's also providing the vision for the system and path to evolve, will also have a direct impact on the various business integration initiatives and the transformation using these mobile technologies. That becomes actually very core. So when you look at the intersection between those technologies that I just talked about and the roles, it starts giving you a matrix, I would say, work items and roles that could potentially be in the quadrant which could potentially be globalized.
So Pankaj, I know recently when I was talking to one of one of our media clients, and they were talking about part of their revenue drivers is advertising, and when they are talking to clients and pitching proposals, one of the key roles that happens to come from the technology side is, like, for example, a MicroStrategy developer who is working with the salesperson to help figure out the analytics package that would be put together. And often, since they are getting new sources of data constantly coming in, and they're slicing and dicing the data and presenting, from a print advertising package to a digital advertising package to an app advertising package, that complexity and that constant interaction that has to happen with the salesperson and many times a potential advertiser, all of a sudden that impact of transformation, hot skill, business integration ends up being core. Whereas the underlying data platform, when they are testing certain ongoing key functions, key reporting, ends up being contextual.
Yeah, that's so true, Atul, and you bring up a good point. So MicroStrategy in itself may not be very core, but when you put in all the other parameters that particular role is doing, I think it starts making it core. And I have another example from one of our banking clients, and this is interesting because they had a group of people, and all of it was called like the package software consultant, basically developers. But one group within that larger group was working on enterprise applications such as Oracle and PeopleSoft, and again the modules were HCM, CRM, and the EPMs. And they were working on generic architecture, which required commodity and mainstream technical skills. That's very contextual. But the same group of people, when they were working on content management or master data management and package software that needed high customizations with specific business process and rules management, BRMs, then that was very core for the client. And again, it based on the nature of the work they were doing, and also laying it with the technology that they were working on, I think that gave that answer of what could be globalized.
Right. So I think one of the things that's important to mention again is that we found that there's multiple factors that make a decision. And so we realized early on that instead of just looking at what others were doing or what somebody thought, it was important to take a look at, if you're looking at sourcing technology, take a look at the technology layer, but then look at the role layers and then look at it together. So for example, some of the factors that we have learned working with our clients that matters. And and when I say we have learned, it's not just what people have sourced, but also now that we've been in business 15 years, you also are able to track and see what worked and what didn't work, right? So there's good feedback. Age of the technology, complexity of the technology, how long has it been around, how stable is it, how documented is it, how unique is it, right? Is the technology, how mobile is it, or is mobility required? What is the life cycle? Is it in retirement phase? Is it investment phase? What kind of IP is integrated? What kind of IP is part of it? How business critical is it? And what is the strategic impact? Is it revenue? Is it efficiency? Or is it just run operations? And all those, what we have found is you make that into a stakeholder engagement and data-led process. And then when you start to overlay roles on that, we found that it's important to be able to see what is the company knowledge that's required for that particular role. What is the technology knowledge that's required, or is there non-technical knowledge that's required? What kind of availability is needed? Is there something driving them to be in the same time zone, co-located, or can they be somewhere else? What is the affinity with the client? What is the affinity with the team? How do they get instructions? How do they get feedback? Can these instructions, do they have to be live? Do they have to be synchronous? Can they be asynchronous? And then what impact would attrition have? And would travel be required in the sense that, how often is that face-to-face interaction that's required? A number of other factors that start to play a role. And then on top of technology and the role, we find that looking at risks are also critical. Risks that are related to continuity of the business. What happens if there's a disruption? What impact does that have? What about competitive risk? Well, what if What if that was sourced? Is that knowledge availability to others create a risk? What about reputation risk? And then from a cost investment, often clients have to think about what is the upfront investment that's needed, ongoing investment, what kind of savings are you trying to drive? And then from a scale perspective, are you trying to build a center of excellence? Is there a benefit to having a scale? And then again, going back to if attrition were to happen, what impact would that have? So many times a client may not outsource a single position because of attrition risk, where if it is a team, they can think about a bench to be able to drive that. But again, just illustrating the point that it absolutely needs to be data driven. And in fact, one of the things I wanted to show you is we grabbed a snapshot from one of a recent portfolio assessment or this core context assessment, and you start to see that what one is doing is driving a numeric score, but also a score where you could build an algorithm. That's what we do in the back. So this model in the back has an algorithm that says if documentation is this and uniqueness is this and age of the technology is this and so on and so forth, the result ought to be highly core, middle, or highly context. So it's able to drive this complex look at something from not just the technology perspective, but also a rule perspective. Before I move on and Pankaj starts to talk about how to think about it from a business function perspective, what I want to be able to do is do a poll to kind of see how do you do it today. So Laurence, do you mind bringing up the poll so people can when you take a look at this poll, hopefully you're all able to see it. Laurence, do you mind reading the A, B, C, D options? Because I cannot see it on my screen, what the options are for people to answer.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So this poll, as Atul was mentioning, is to see what the process looks like within your own organization at this time. So the question reads, how do you currently decide what to source? And the options are: individual leaders decide, you do what has been done by others, you consult with internal experts within your organization, or you follow a structured consultant-led process. And I see, Atul, the responses are coming in. We'll give a few more heartbeats.
Yes, thank you, Laurent. So 57% of you have voted. So I'm hoping a few more vote so that then we can lock it in. You know, it's interesting for me how often when we are working with clients that historically how they have looked at it, what they have learned, and then how they're making a decision today. So we have almost 70% of you that have answered, so I'm going to lock it in at this point in time. So, and then I'm going to share the results. So you can see that in our audience today, about 20% where individual leaders decide, another 14% do what has been done by others, about a third of you consult with internal experts, and only about 30% are following a structured process that's led by external consultants. So the good news for me is there's plenty of opportunity for us as consultants to do that. But also I think what this highlights for me is I think there's an opportunity for companies to really think about what to source as a much more structured, data-driven, expertise-led process. Often people think about sourcing as all about what's happening in the supply location, but we find that sourcing is as much about what you do, what your business is, what your business objectives are, and then taking a look at what your technology roles or business process are. So let me jump to the next part, Pankaj, and I think we have plenty of time to illustrate by examples. And before I do that, Pankaj, there's a question that's come up that I'd love for you to weigh in on. The question is, what are the key factors that decision makers depend on when they're listening to internal experts or or external experts? So what are some of the key factors that decision makers are looking for, Pankaj, in your point of view, when they're looking towards experts, both internal or external?
All right. So I think one, obviously, from when you're presenting to executives or decision makers, the first thing that they definitely look at is the entire business impact and risk. So what's going to be the business impact, not only from a financial benefit point of view, but also in general in terms of the strategic advantage that they may have, or the risk associated with it, whether those risks could be managed. And if there are certain risks, then what are the key enablers to mitigate those risks and be able to proceed with the strategy? So that's one piece. The other piece is about when you come down to the roles, I think there needs to be a little internal expertise or the help of outside consultant in terms of the entire disaggregation and aggregation of the various tasks from the roles. So not always you will see that the tasks are one-to-one mapping. There would be certain pieces of roles from tasks from certain role that has to be taken. So how do you go about doing that disaggregation and aggregation without disrupting the current business? So I think those are the major factors that we have seen. And obviously, what follows after that, once that decision is taken, is around training and transition management and transition planning. But overall, I think that's what it is. And in one of the slides, Atul, you mentioned about the affinity with clients and teams, and when you look at it, it sounds very simple. But when we look at it in depth, and when you present those analysis to the clients, I think it becomes very easier for them to take those decisions. Because when we talk about affinity, we're not only looking at whether the person is talking to the other person or the teams are talking to the other teams, but also about what's the degree of that interaction, what's the kind of collaboration that those teams or roles are doing, what is the complexity of the integration, what is the exposure to the sensitive data, and what's the criticality of those resources. So I think when you combine all these parameters, then I think it becomes very easy to take those decisions.
Right. No, that's a good point. And I think I want to reaffirm that cost, while a driver, and I think that's a given, there's many situations we're watching and we're seeing now where simply the scarcity of talent in some areas is making clients source. And in that case, they're willing to spend the same or sometimes more to be able to get access to that talent. So while cost is a driving factor often for mature clients and for certain specific areas of specialization, cost is losing out to simply the ability to access talent. So I would encourage the audience to please, keep asking questions, and of course, please share your point of view. This is not just about us, which is Pankaj and I sharing our point of view. I'm a firm believer in wisdom of the crowd, and I know that the audience, you out there that's listening to this webinar, have plenty you can add. So feel free to do that, and I'll be happy to bring it up as I see it come. So, Pankaj, let's jump to the next topic. And the topic is, we've kind of moved from technology to business process. And let's start talking about what we see from a business process perspective and the whole core context, what to keep, what to source. Can you illustrate, maybe first starting with the process and then going to role, examples of how you see core versus context?
Yeah, sure, Atul. And again, I'll start with an example, and I just briefly touched upon, the gaming company. Again, accounts payable, which was very low touch, low complexity, and it was practically leveraged for operational efficiencies, and ultimately led to a center of excellence for all the studios globally. That was more contextual, as an example for business processes. On the other hand, like treasury and certain pieces of FP&A, which was around cash management and investments, which were high touch, requiring quick executive decisions that were complex and had strategic business impact. I think those are the strategic advantage. Those were the ones that were very core to that company. Having said that, again, as we pointed out earlier, there may be certain elements of, for example, in FP&A, the entire reporting, board of director presentation, everything was globalized. I think it was more about the strategic decisions that were required was kept within the company onshore. The other example I can think of is a retail company, which we worked with last year. Again, from a contextual point of view, the entire hiring and recruitment, and again, pieces of it, for example, the entire resumes management, the scheduling of interviews, or the reporting and the onboarding and offboarding is pretty contextual and could easily be globalized. Whereas one of the process which required mergers and acquisitions, again, from a financial point of view, but it was around M&A paying agreements or accounting, which was managing M&A escrow reconciliations or reviewing the tax liabilities on escrows. That was core because it also had an element of an IP and strategic advantage. So those, I think, from a business process, again, when you start looking at processes, you would see, as in technology, there are certain elements within a core and context also which could flip, or which could be a contextual element within a core or a core element within a contextual. But on a high level, when you look at the processes, these are some of the items that you would look at.
Yeah, I think I'm going to kind of highlight the same, right? So when I one example that I was using was on analytics, right? So that whole advertising example that I was using, if you think about it, it's a high touch intimacy. Why? Because for the analyst, there's a significant interaction that happens with the sales leader, sales team. And then often there's an interaction that happens with the potential advertiser, which is a potential client, right? And if you think about it, it's about, for this company, it's core in the sense that it's about strategic advantage. Why? Because it's about revenue, right? And the ability, and this part of analytics helps make a decision on whether somebody is going to advertise or not. The process complexity can be from medium to high, and it's because often you are dealing with the multiple properties. You might be dealing with iOS app on one end. On the other end would be a digital magazine, would be a print magazine, would be a website. And so all that comes together. And so in that case, from a business process perspective, that whole pitch, or from the next page, in terms of being a role perspective, I'm sorry, I'll get to that later, that it becomes core. But there's portions of it, right? And then interestingly, for that exact same part, the deck preparation, the presentation, as you start looking at it, what you realize is, because they're dealing with the analyst who's internal to the company, it's really a low touch, it's low process. While it is of strategic advantage, but the other components, the customer impact and the process complexity, is low. And so this is a customer where that role is globalized, right? So even though the core process was very core, or the main process was very core, as you start looking at the different people working on it, you realize one of them is actually very critical and core, but the other would be context. So I know, Pankaj, as you were expanding on it, you were talking about both the demand drivers and the constraints. Maybe you can kind of expand on this page a little bit.
Yeah, so obviously I talked about the business value add as one of the factors that is being looked at more often. Obviously, process complexity becomes very important because in certain cases, as Atul was pointing out, for example, the ad marketing piece is complex in certain pieces, especially when it starts touching the agencies and the clients, external clients, and then the entire customer impact. So what's really impacting your customers? Does process directly touch those external clients? Is it revenue generating? Is it supporting the revenue generation? Or is it just a plain reporting function? So I think all those parameters will have to be looked at, and also the risks involved with that. On the supply side, again, it becomes very important, especially when you're looking at sensitive data, what kind of techniques you utilize to ensure that you're covering those risks, whether the competencies in those market exist. Like one of the media clients we are working with right now, we are finding that so media, I think as an industry, has been a little new in globalizing some of the core functions. You're not talking about finance, HR, and procurement, but other functions which are very core to them. They are also now started to look at in globalization. We're finding on the supply side the competencies may not exist. So I think about competencies, the IP risk, business continuity, and also looking at what models do you choose from. Is it going to be your own center? Is it a single vendor or multiple vendors? So I think based on all that stuff, you have to choose and make a decision whether the work items or the roles that you're looking at could be globalized.
So considering, Pankaj, as you're saying, I think the intersection of many of these factors at the same time, and again, so we walked through the process side of it. We walked through kind of how you will look at a process within a business function. Now let's take a look at the roles. Pankaj, it would be good for you to again illustrate this, maybe using some case studies.
Yeah, sure. So on the role side, example that comes to my mind would be a retail client. Obviously, considering it's a retail client, there's a lot of procurement happening. So the procurement specialist, and especially when they're working on gathering requirements or opening requisitions and managing regular updates, it's though critical, it's typically agnostic of industries and is very mainstream and operational. That would be like a contextual role. And again, as I pointed out, there are certain tasks that I pointed out. Those are the contextual piece. But when it starts coming like into negotiations or contracting, that may be a little core. On the core side, the example that I took, and this was also applicable to the retail client, but when you start looking at from end-to-end processes, which requires strong native knowledge, and maybe a person who's a functional specialist and focuses on transformation to build optimal efficiencies on the global processes end-to-end, that may be a core function or a core role for the client.
You know, it's interesting. So let me use an example between an insurance company and versus a media company and making different decisions. The insurance company has a data initiative in place. They, in fact, appointed a chief data officer. And one of the key perspectives they have is they're looking to figure out ways to reduce cost of processing claims. On the other end, they have initiatives focused on understanding customer segments and finding new opportunities, new products, but also improving the retention of customers. So when you start, and then the area that they focused on, the chief data officer is focusing on is building up an analytical capability. So they realize that the processes that they're looking for are specialized. They're focused on insurance, right? There's parts of it within insurance that they consider to be mainstream. That they consider claims management, many parts of claims management to be mainstream, whereas there's portions of it that are specialized. And then what they recognize is that when they look at the cultural affinity, that the people working on it, the analysts working on it, don't necessarily need to understand the customer base when it came to the whole cost management side. On the new customer segment, new customer approaches, what they realized here was that the data that they had on customers also made it such that the soft skills to the analysts don't require understanding of the customer base. Now, from a business domain knowledge perspective, when they looked at it, what they realized was that the knowledge that they want analysts to have is really focused on understanding the statistical tools, understanding data, be able to mine the data, even though the project is transformative when it comes to reducing the cost of claims, which in that case is operational, but the customer segment, finding new customers, new products is transformative. That their conclusion was that when it all came together, it was contextual. And they actually outsourced that analyst roles to one of the BPO companies. When I switch to the other side and take a look at the experience of the media company, in their case, very similar. They have a chief data officer that's being recruited. The focus is very much on a single view of the customer. But in their case, the data is used. The data is the product. The data is sold. the data is what provides the analysis and guidance towards the advertisers, for example. So they want a process expertise that's specialized, that understands advertising, that understands media. They feel that the cultural affinity that's required for these analysts is high. They need to understand marketing marketers as such. And of course, the domain knowledge that's required is transformative in the sense that this is about new media, digital media, and this whole intersection of digital media and advertising. So in their case, they felt that they needed to continue to own it. Now, they are globalizing part of it, but still in their own in-house center. So again, right, if we had looked at the same customer acquisition and said, oh, customer acquisition is X, whether it's core or context, the reality is it differs depending on the company. It differs. Is different depending on the industry and different depending on the culture of the company. So I just want to illustrate the point why you can make the same decision even though the information may be similar, but the context is very different. So Pankaj, can you take us through this slide a little bit more detail on some of the role-based demand drivers and constraints?
Sure. So I think as I mentioned earlier also, one of the things that really is from a demand side becomes very important for the executives when they're looking at globalization is the domain knowledge. And when I say domain knowledge, it's not only about the industry knowledge that's required to perform function on those areas, but also the company knowledge. What level of knowledge is required for that? Is it and what kind of training may be required? What's the time required for someone to achieve that proficiency? What levels of skills are available? So I think that again is a very important factor. On the process expertise is, and this ties into the domain knowledge in terms of what are the kind of dependencies that you may have across processes for that particular process, and do the retained roles are they very unique, or some portions of that could potentially be globalized. And again, so you may have to look at whether what's expert and what's commodity. That's this most simple way of saying it. But I think even we are seeing that more and more chipping is being done out of the expertise because the competencies are being developed in other locations. And then what's the cultural affinity required? Some companies are very strong on maintaining the cultural affinity either with the supplier or with their own centers. And then what are the compatibility that may be required to ensure that is maintained? So from a constraint, and again, I think this ties into the technology piece also. What's the availability in the market? Whether it's about suppliers with the competencies that may be required, whether it's a technology solution that may be required to enable globalization or delivery of services, and then what's the skill sets, whether the skill sets are available or not, and if they are, then what's the level of training or documentation that may be required to make that happen. And then the final, I think we have talked about this enough in terms of what the financial benefits are vis-a-vis the risks that we have to take on. So one of the things that we also do in our assessment is we map out the risk very clearly. So if you remember, we were talking about when we do the analysis, we also talk about the various sequencing when the roles or the work items could potentially be globalized, what time frame and how do they move. At the same time, we make it very clear that if something is moving or some work items or roles have additional risks associated with them, that moves in a later time period. Or vice versa, if there's something is moving or something has to move, then what are the additional risks that you have to take on, and what are the mitigation strategy that you have to work on to make that happen?
Right. I think it's important to mention, Pankaj, that the whole concept of process redesign, role redesign also plays a role in this assessment. So just because a certain competency does not exist in a supply market does not rule it out of not happening. Often what we think about is, what is the base requirement? I remember, as old as 27, 28 years ago, when Citigroup, for example, first went to India, they actually hired developers irrespective of experience. And what they did, for example, at that point in time was that they actually focused on hiring engineers, and they could be an engineer in any discipline, because they felt that that was the raw ingredient for them to be able to then train people. And so they felt that they could do that and create developers. Now we're seeing the same thing in terms of analytics, that people are looking and saying, well, I'm not able to find a certain kind of analyst, but I do know that what I can actually find is people with strong backgrounds in statistics or finance, and then I'm able to actually put together a training program to train them to make sure that that skill set is available. So some of the other factors, just kind of a little bit more detailed, is from a process perspective. What Pankaj, his case studies talked about was things like, what is the strategic impact? Is it purely operational or is it transformative? Transformative often could be new products, could be focused on new revenues, and so it's significant change, not just efficiency. How complex is the process? Complexity can be related to the multiple touch points, can be related to knowledge. So there's a number of other factors that one has to think about. How sensitive is that process to the customer? So if there's any changes, any kind of disruptions, or what is the contact that happens with the customer? How well documented it is. I think people recognize that lower documentation leads to challenges, but it's more important for something that's highly complex compared to something that is not as complex, right? And then how unique is that process? Is it something that's early stage new? How sensitive is that process to the location? And often the reason something is sensitive is because of how instructions are given, how feedback is had, or how that work is actually carried out. And then confidentiality, IP matters. Sometimes it's related to customer information, sometimes it's related to competition. And then from a business perspective, how mission critical is it, or is it not mission critical, right? That starts to play a very important role. Sorry about that. So from a other role perspective, I think you saw some of that on the technology side also. From a role perspective, some of the factors that matter are things like, is company knowledge required, industry knowledge required, is this transformation skills? Transformation skills might be related to significant change. What kind of process expertise is required? What's the affinity with the customer? What's the affinity with the team, internal team, business team, or is it same team? And then are there any time zone factors people should be aware of? And then I think on page 21, you see the same things you saw before on the technology side. What are the risks related to reputation, competition, continuity? What kind of investments are required? Are you trying to create a center of excellence? So all those factors come together. And what I'm moving to now is truly a conclusion. So hopefully kind of what you've heard from Pankaj and I, both on the technology side and the business process side, is that one has to consider both the process or the application and the role. So it's not just about looking at one, but you have to look at both. Some of the things that you have to look at is business impact and the risks. One has to take a look at what are the operations requirements. We've come across situations where a piece of technology actually was not accessible other than during the daytime, or a piece of technology was not accessible to anybody that was remotely, right? So what are the operational requirements? Is it same time zone, not same time zone? And then what are the skill requirements? Skill not just related to the technology or the process, but also maybe skill requirements related to how somebody interacts and collaborates with both internal and external customers. What kind of documentation exists, and then what kind of training is required? How long does it take for somebody to come up to speed? And often that'll lead to decisions on things like bench. Bench might mean is how many people are available to be able to work on that process or the technology if there's any attrition or any changes. And then assessing the role, which is what does that role do? What part of the time is that role working on processing, managing, contributing, analyzing, or a special skill set, a special knowledge that's required? And how does that spread over that role? And then in our approach, in our methodology, we also do process maps whenever we are looking at either a technology or a business process, because we find that often you're able to see dependencies, you're able to see the different intersections, and you're able to see some of the roadblocks because of that. And then doing a quantitative analysis that basically also considers decisions such as locations, because there's a difference between sourcing to Mexico versus Brazil versus Colombia versus Philippines, India, China, Poland, Hungary. There's difference in these factors. So while you're looking at the demand side, one also has to look at the supply side. And then looking at ownership, right? Am I going to own this? Am I going to leverage a supplier? Putting risk overlay on top of that. Sometimes risk might simply be about reputation. Others it might be about data. Other times it might be about competitive factors and others. And then are there opportunities to redesign the role or the business process? Should we be consolidating? As we are doing role analysis, often clients will recognize that they may have scores of people where only X percent, 10% of their work is focused on analytics, whereas 70% is focused on processing. Maybe we need to cluster those processing roles, cluster the analytic roles, and create a center of excellence for the analytics, whereas we find that the processing part can now be sourced. And then transitioning, what should be transitioned when? Often we find that when we are doing as part of this process, this analysis, that certain things that might be more challenging ought to be done after certain things have been done. And so the near-term opportunities have limited risk. They may be based on interactions that are transactional in nature, full roles. You don't have to break them down and necessarily redesign, whereas others require redesign or are better done when the first pieces of work is done. The other things I want to share is what we have seen, and Pankaj, I want you to jump in also and kind of share your thoughts. We have seen that often success, even once this analysis is done, making sure you socialize this with the functional leads, the functional teams, and make sure that they're helping you identify the gaps, the risks, but also risk mitigation that's being done before it's reviewed with the executives and fully agreed on. Pankaj, do you want to jump in and any advice on what you have seen when it comes to the whole recommendation socialization process?
So I think two things. One, our process and methodology actually includes and collaborates with all the stakeholders right from the beginning. So it's the owners who are providing the data on which we do the analysis. When we present the recommendations to them for feedback and also explaining to them the rationale of why we believe something could be globalized, they understand because it's coming from the data that they provided, but we are presenting and also utilizing our collective skills and experience in providing the rationale to it. So they're already bought in. I think so. One of the things that I would say from a company point of view, it becomes much easier for a buy-in into the recommendations and then making sure that they are bought into the entire transition thereafter, which makes it a little easier in the entire globalization. And then jointly working on the risk and how to mitigate them, because sometimes the owners would have a better insights and they would know the nuances of how to mitigate some of those risks. I think makes it easier for the decision makers once they have the full scope and they have the full enablers in front of them to take those decisions.
So Pankaj, I think you brought up a really good point, and maybe it's the right place to end this, which is the point that you've made is that engaging the team because the teams are the ones, the process owners, the process participants are the ones that are providing the data that feeds this model. And the end result of that there is greater buy-in, there's greater visibility and transparency into what's possible, and specifically what risks are attached to what's possible. So Pankaj, with that, I want to thank you particularly for giving your time and sharing your experience in case studies. And I want to thank the audience for being on the webinar today and for participating. And I want to encourage you to please send us questions. You see my email and Pankaj's email right on here. Any comments, any questions you might have, both on this webinar, but also any other areas of interest, topics of interest that you are seeing that may be important to you. And because we always keep an eye out on our clients, our audience, in terms of what should be the content and focus of our next webinar. I also want to encourage you, when you get a chance, to please go to neogroup.com and supplywisdom.com. In the news and knowledge section, there's tremendous amount of information and previous webinars and point of views and insights that are available. Please take a moment to take that opportunity to take a look at it and share it with others. And once more, thank you so much for making time for this webinar, and all have a good day. And Pankaj, once again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Atul, and nice being here on this webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Bye.